Now let's start moving on to making actual GET requests from the wrapper class, utilizing the endpoint and the base URL. So I'll add this instance method getSpec, and we're going to be using VCR, which means that we're going to need the VCR gem as well as the webmock gem. So I'll add those to the blanket gem spec. And run bundle install. That installed successfully. Now we just have to require that in the spec helper. So I require VCR here, and also add a VCR configuration block like so. I'm just filtering sensitive data here because I'll be using the Twitter API key and the GitHub API key later on. For the first get spec, I'll be using the API JSON placeholder, which looks something like that. Alright, so let's define that instance method get, run the spec, undefined method code for nil class. That's because the instance method get is returning nil. So what we want to do is we want to make a http party.get request to the URL, which we can assign it to a response variable. Now if we run that, it will complain we don't have http party, so we better install that too. Bundle install. That's successfully installed, so we better require that now, which I'll require it just underneath here. Let's try running the spec again. We get this odd message, can't convert blanket wrapper to string, blanket wrapper to string, use blanket wrapper, which isn't very helpful. But what I believe is happening is that HTTP request try convert. I think it's trying to convert this URL here, which isn't defined, so it's having a few issues. So let's fix that. We can turn this URL into a method, which will combine the base URL and the endpoint together. So perhaps create a private method, define URL, and we can do some string interpolation here. So we call that base URL, do that, and endpoint.join like so. And I think that should work. Cool. Alright, let's also test the context of what would happen if we make multiple requests with the same client. So yeah, we initialize a client here, and then we make a request followed by another request, right? So let's see what happens to this. Get an error. VCR is complaining, saying that it does not know how to handle this file here. And it's interesting because the path is post1, post2, which I never intentionally made that request. So what's happening? Let's take a look at the console. We initialize the placeholder, make a get request. So that works, but this doesn't work. Returns empty hash, and that's because when you look at placeholder, if you look at the endpoints, the previous request is carrying over into this array, which is not what we want. So what we have to do is reset the endpoint array after every get request. So let's try that. And return response. So let's reload the console. Initialize placeholder again. I'll make the request with this one, so that works. Let's make the second request, and that works now. So that seemed to solve the problem. And as we can see, the placeholder client, the endpoint has been reset to an empty array again. Let's run the tests, and now we're back to green. Let's create a spec for when we make a request to a URL that doesn't exist. So it could be like a typo like this where we add an extra S to the post. So let's run that. And we get initialize constant blanket not found. So let's create an error.rb file. And do this. I think let's just grab the error that was given to us when we created the gem. And then I'll create a custom one. Perhaps we can write a case statement here that will check the code. When 404 raise not found on you. See if that works. Okay, because I forgot to require the error file. Cool. And now let's add a few more different types of errors that we could get in a HTTP request. So this means that we can change the case statement to cover a lot more different scenarios. And we'll define an error message this time. Something like this. So the tests should still pass, and we should get a much friendlier error message when we make a mistake. So this typo example responds with server responded with code 404, message not found, request URI, and it'll tell you what URI you requested. So here you can clearly see that you've made a typo. Let's take a look at how the response is currently returned at the moment. So I'll go into the console and create a GitHub client. And what I'll do is we'll make a request to the blanket repo. Alright, so this is the response we get, which is if we take a look, here's a HTTP party response object. And let's say, when we want to get some data from this, right? Perhaps we want to get the name of the repo, stargazers count sort of thing. So let's try that. Repo stargazers count. And say we want to get some information regarding the owner of the repo. And we can grab the login name like so, right? Which is fine, but I think it would be much better if we could do like repo.stargazers count like so, and also repo owner, repo.owner.login. To me, it feels more natural to retrieve data in that sort of dot notation. So let's try and implement that. Alright, so here's a spec here to test out the context of a dot notation on a response. So nothing really changes. It's just, yeah, just using the dot notation now. So let's test that out. Yeah, we can see it's failing. So we'll go over here. What we can do is something like this, right? And get rid of that response. So the response.body returns a string of JSON. And this object class OpenStruct argument specifies that the JSON data should be passed into an instance of the OpenStruct class, which is a Ruby class that allows for dynamic creation of structured data. So if we go back, the test should work now. And yep, we can see it passing. The only problem is that these old tests are failing. The reason that they're failing is because they're not using the dot notation form. So let's fix that up. Delete these two. Yep, so it's one failing now. Let's go down to this one here. Delete that. Yep, and it's working all again. So far our get request method is quite one-dimensional since it's only taking in a URL. So let's modify our get request so that we can pass headers with, say, like an API key, for example, or user agent like that. So I've written a spec here which makes a request to Twitter, and it passes the Twitter API key in the headers. So we'll use this as an example, but first, before I do that, I just want to extract that validation logic up here into its own private method. So I'll just move that over here and then make sure to call that and collect this method. Okay, so let's see if that works. Okay, so we get wrong number of arguments given 1. Okay. That's because it's passing headers as a keyword argument. So let's add headers as a keyword argument here. And HTTP party can take in the headers like this. And I think that should just work. So it's relatively easy, just like that. Now we can pass headers to our requests. Alright, so I find it quite repetitive having to pass headers with an API key every time I make a GET request. So it would be nice if we can initialize the wrapper instance with a default headers. So I've got a spec for that right here. So rather than passing headers to the GET request, we're going to pass it to the wrap method, and they'll initialize it with default headers. So let's test that out. And here we get wrong number of arguments given to expected one for the wrap method. So let's go to that. Default headers, and we must initialize that with the default headers like so. Let's see what happens now. So now in the initialize we get wrong number of arguments given to expected one. So now we can go back to the initialize method. And I'll make that an attribute reader as well. Okay, let's see what happens now. So server responded with code 401, message unauthorized. And this is the request URL. So you can see that those validations are coming in handy now. So the path is correct, but obviously the API key isn't being made in the request. So what we can do here is, because in the GET we're not making use of the default headers here, so we'll do that right here. And I think that will work now. Beautiful.